Hello and welcome to another open source workplace video. If this is your first time coming across the channel, please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you're alerted to all upcoming videos. Today I'm very happy to welcome back Ken van Someren of Cognition. Ken, how are you doing, sir? Great to see you again.
Yeah, I'm very good. Thanks, Steve. How are you?
Doing very well, doing very well. So we've spoke a lot about, performance. We've talked about resiliency. We've talked about mentality, and we've talked about, how do you keep yourself performing and sort of as we have moved through, the office environment to the home environment. But now we're about to enter into a whole new atmosphere of as offices reopen. And I really love to dig in and get some of your thoughts on really the emotional and resiliency and everything connected with, one from an employee perspective. Let's maybe talk about that perspective, and we can move on to a leadership perspective. But as the offices open, what are some of the emotional things that employees need to sort of make themselves aware of and sort of allow themselves to create that resilient mindset and can keep that performance going as offices begin to open and they see colleagues get in and perhaps they don't feel as comfortable going into the office?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. It's a really interesting and timely topic. And I think, the preface to the discussion is that, of course, there's no one size fits all, and not everyone is going to be experiencing the same thing. And I think the beauty of taking some of the sporting insights and strategies that we do from my background and that we do at Boost is that we put a high degree of individualization on what we do. So it's really about understanding, well, what are the drivers and what are the sources of friction? What are the causes of stress and anxiety for the individual? And many individuals will be fairly good at identifying what that is for themselves, but that's not always the case. So one of the things we do is very much focusing on measuring energy and stress to give us an objective and quantifiable measure of this. So we're dealing with a single version of the truth as opposed to employers think this, employees think that. And we've spoken in the past about how many people are thriving in the working from home environment. Many people are really struggling, not least for the lack of social cohesion. And of course, whether they've been furloughed or whether they're still working, they're away from the office, they're out of sight. What does that mean for, perception of them in their work as well? So, there's all sorts of factors that are going to be creating stress and anxiety for people, both, over the last few weeks and months working from home, but also that return to the office. And I think why this is so important is what we're not doing here is talking about wrapping people in cotton wool and making life easy for them. And again, we know this in sport. Sport is really tough, but you're not going to get elite performance by constantly beating people and making life hard for them. Resilience, as we've spoken about in the past, is all about preparing people, increasing their capacity through fitness and capability, improving energy levels, but also building in enough rest and recovery to be able to do that. And again, rest and recovery isn't necessarily about lying down with your feet up. It can be doing the work that's energizing. Now, we've spoken in the past, there's plenty of people during this working from home period that, a lot of the work they've been doing, unfortunately, hasn't been terribly energizing. It's been back-to-back Zoom and Teams video conferencing, which is exhausting. They're juggling personal responsibilities with work responsibilities as well. And that all takes a toll. And, just to share a couple of insights that we've seen when we actually measure energy and stress in people. And what we see is very often when people think they're busy and they're busy at work, yes, there's a level of arousal, if you like, but it's not having a negative impact, because very often what we're doing at work in our professional lives is what we've been trained to do, and it's what we're qualified to do. And so we're almost in a state of flow doing some of it. It's when you then have to juggle that with the personal responsibilities of being home, the unfamiliar environment where there's greater levels of distraction, that becomes more stressful. And it's not uncommon for us to see that, you know, for busy executives, actually the most stressful part of the day is getting out the door of the house in the morning, and then when they get back to work, and possibly, come back in the evening, and possibly the weekend. And if we don't appreciate that, and we don't build in enough time for rest and recovery and recharging the batteries, if you like, then we're going to be in trouble. And we measure this through something called heart rate variability, which is simply the variation in the time intervals between consecutive heartbeats. And if we have a high level of variability, that shows a predominance of our parasympathetic or our rest and digest nervous system. A low variability is an indication and a measure of a dominant sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight response. So a high state of arousal and a high state of stress that's incredibly fatiguing. So we get some really interesting insights there, which is important to us because, as I say, you're dealing with objective data. And, you know, I think that maybe leads us on to the next point about, well, how employers, you know, how do employers do this? And what we're trying to urge employers to do and provide employers with is the objective and the evidence base to inform the business thinking. And that business thinking may well span, you know, how much real estate do we need, but also what are the ways of working and what sort of culture and teamship do we want to organize, develop within the organization. But maybe before flipping over to the sort of the employer and what it means for commercial real estate, you know, is there anything if that sort of resonates with what you're seeing and you're hearing in terms of the individual aspects?
Yeah, no, you mentioned a few things there that resonated with me, right? One was you talked about Zoom fatigue, but then you talked about, you know, athletes' performance and how that extends. And, you know, I often wonder myself as weeks go past, actually, does my Zoom fatigue decrease because actually I'm getting more suited to it, right? My body's becoming and my brain's becoming more equipped to manage it. And actually, I don't feel as tired as days go on. And therefore, am I acclimatizing to that performance that you just mentioned? And that's sort of what triggered in my head. And, you know, the other aspect of it is with Zoom fatigue, you know, whenever the office opens and people go back to the office, will Zoom meetings decrease? And therefore, the actual interaction that people feel with their team decreases with that. And is there a risk emotionally about that connectedness that may disappear? And that's sort of where some of my thoughts sort of lie around some of the things you just said.
Yeah, and just quickly on that, I think, you know, that's the beauty of being human. We are incredibly adaptable, and whilst many people don't, or they feel they don't respond particularly well to change, we are incredibly adaptable. You know,
Yeah.
not least the brain. The brain is incredibly adaptable. But just as, you know, athletes train not because they enjoy training, they train to impose a stress on the body, and the body adapts to that. So that same task becomes easier in the future. Yeah, Zoom fatigue is probably decreasing for people, or certainly the same volume of Zoom calls. The fatigue imposed and the stress imposed by that is decreasing because we do adapt. And actually, that you know, just touching on that point about the brain being very adaptable as well. You know, this is why understanding stress is so important, because stress significantly compromises and decreases our cognitive power. So our brain power, our alertness, our focus, our cognitive flexibility, moving from one task to another, our problem solving, our decision making. If we're stressed by whatever that might be, not only does that take a physiological toll on us, but it's also going to decrease our cognitive function at any point in time as well, which clearly is not what we want for our employees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. It sort of took my mind to a study that I read where it was very simply if an individual measures their happiness and their stress levels from a 0 to 10, where would they rank each? And often there's the adverse correlation. So stress is high, happiness is low, and vice versa, right? But then for some people, it's actually when their stress is high, that's often sometimes when they're happiest, right? So people need that. So if you think about elite sport athletes, they need that stress to actually get that happiness sometimes as well. So
Yeah.
it's an interesting balance that each individual, I think, has to find for themselves.
And that's right. You know, stress is good. If none of us had any stress in our lives, then we would stagnate.
Right,
You know,
right.
there'd be nothing to adapt to. So we do need a level, but of course, you know, there's at times a cliff edge to this where too much stress can lead to burnout. Um, Clearly a problem, and we see severe illness in many people in that case. But I would suggest, you know, if we're waiting for burnout or signs of burnout, we've got this completely wrong. We'd never do this
Yeah,
in the sport. We need to monitor and we need to identify underperformance, or what I've seen some people refer to in the business world as standing still. And, you know, as soon as we identify that, we need to change something. We need to go in with different strategies.
yeah.
Because, you know, employees and particularly, you know, senior execs, if they're standing still, you know, they're not delivering for the business. Your greatest asset is not performing. So that's really
Yeah,
important to get
yeah.
right.
No, no, I mean, and you'll know more than sort of the rest of us, but you know, through training is periodization, right? It's usually 3 weeks on, 1 week of recovery. That's kind of how the periodization works. And yet, in this work life and everything else going on, it just seems to be it's 4 weeks of optimal performance. So yeah. So let's sort of shift it back to the employer side, Ken, on with the employer's perspective. How do the employer manage, you know, the employees returning to the office?
Yeah, I think there's two really important aspects here. One is role modeling, and the second is
Yeah.
listening. Um, you know, and in terms of role modeling, unfortunately, all too often, you know, C-suite leaders are not necessarily role modeling the best well-being and indeed performance behaviors. You know, incredibly driven, but and often delivering business results. But again, we often see they're not at their best. And at times they're running themselves ragged. And just with a different approach and a focus more on some of their lifestyle behaviors, they could improve their capacity and their energy and therefore their resilience. So role modeling is incredibly important. You know, that sets the tone, it sets the culture within an organization, as we all know. But the other thing is listening, because frankly, until we ask, we don't know what is stressing people out. We don't know what people are anxious about. We may feel as a company, isn't it great we're bringing people back together again? You know, we don't know whether a certain individual lives with elderly parents, for example, and is terrified of going back into an environment. So the stress and anxiety is around physical health and COVID. For others, it may well be, you know, working from home for the introverts has actually been very comfortable, and they far prefer that. And they're dreading going back and, you know, not having mixed with people for a number of months, being back and having that face-to-face contact. And we just don't know. And whilst there has to be a reality to this, you know, I emphasized at the start of this discussion, there's no one size that fits all. We need an individual approach. Now, if we have an organization of 100,000 employees, there's clearly a limit to how individualized we can make that. But, you know, let's just put the emphasis on, we need to listen and we need to seek to understand. And by doing that, we know what we're dealing with and we can reduce that level of stress and anxiety. We can improve employee engagement. And again, if we can do that, we improve cognitive performance, we improve productivity, as well as the well-being aspects. And just to finish that point, you mentioned a couple of moments ago about happiness. And I know we've discussed this in the previous session, but you know, this is incredibly important. And I think for a lot of people, they've probably gone through a period of introspection over the last few weeks and months. And I know there's plenty of people making significant life changes at the moment because they've had the time to think, you know, where do I find meaningful purpose? What makes me happy? And maybe it's something different to what I've been doing. But if people are interested in the science of happiness, a great place to start is reading some of Sean Akers' work. You know, and he's, you know, a load of research coming out of Harvard, published a number of popular science books as well. But the evidence is compelling. You know, happy, positive, and optimistic doctors, quicker and more accurate in their diagnoses. Salespeople outperform less happy, less optimistic counterparts. Business leaders, athletes. I've mentioned this before. You know, happy and positive athletes not only perform better, they get less injured and they get less ill. So it's really important here. And again, I'll finish that by going right back to the start and saying, this is not about wrapping people in cotton wool. It's not about making life easy. It's about appreciating we get more out of people, you know, in the business world by looking after them. Yeah. Happy, healthy employees make good business.
That's great. That's great, Ked. Look, thank you. I appreciate, as always, your insights, your knowledge, and thank you for sharing and articulate everything so well. Appreciate your time today, and look forward to chatting with you very soon.
Absolutely. Well, my pleasure, Steve. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, mate. Cheers. Thanks. Bye.